Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Author Life Chat show on this Tuesday evenings series, which is the stories from the unsung heroes. So today we have Lissa Oliver with us to talk about or probably to give us some tips, as in like from a professional view to um, to guide writers on how to bring their professional writing career to the next level, and also to share with us a little bit of how to weave stories that are relatable and also realistic. So we will also be discussing some of the interesting characters that Lissa has in her books, in one of her latest books, and also talk about her experience being the director of the Irish Board of Writers. And she wears a lot of hats, and she has a vast experience, and she also has like her own writing workshop. So I think it's going to be an exciting interview ahead for today. And so without further ado, let's welcome Lissa to the show. Lissa, welcome to our show today. Thank you for joining us, Lissa.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jasvina. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Right. So, Lissa, could you explain to us, or probably could you tell us a little bit about yourself and also your experience in the writing field, and how long have you been writing so far?
Well, I've been writing since before I started school. Nobody in the family can remember me not writing, and it was always, I loved reading, I loved stories. So when I didn't have a book, or if I was in the classroom where you would get caught for reading a book, it was so easy just to write my own stories. And that's, just all my life I've been creating characters, creating stories just for pleasure. At school, we have plenty of opportunities to write essays, write stories. But then once we leave school, that kind of is taken from us. And I never dreamed that it could be a profession. So I also love horses. So I worked in the horse racing industry with horses in stables, and then later on outside of the stable yard in administration. But I carried on writing as a hobby. And when I finished my first novel, which I wrote in my teens, I thought, well, perhaps I could get this published. But I had no idea how. So I purchased a copy of the Writers and Artists Yearbook. I went through that. There were listings of publishers. So I sent my manuscript as they wanted it, as they listed in the book, to every publisher listed, and collected years and years worth of rejection slips from nearly all the publishers. Then I suppose it would be 12 years ago now, that same first book was accepted by a publisher in Dublin, and I haven't looked back since. So it just goes to show that if you're a writer, you're a writer, and it's not about being published. It's about persevering, faith in your work, and just enjoying what you're doing.
Right. So I think throughout your writing journey, I think you have also been a member of various writing association, and also various writing groups, right? So I think this is the part where a lot of writers, or probably a lot of authors, are looking forward to understand how to bring their writing career, or probably their hobby, to how to shift their hobby into a career, or probably into a professional a path, right? To steer it towards a professional path. So how did that all happen, and how did you, like, decided that, oh, I need to, like, be actively involved in something, in Writers Association, and also to be recognized as an author, or probably to be recognized as a writer, and put your work out there so that people can actually read, put your work out there to be acknowledged as an author. So tell us about that.
Well, yes, it was fairly late. I suppose I was in my late 20s, early 30s when I joined a writing group. And again, it was simply not knowing they were out there. And from my local library, I discovered that they had a writers group. So I joined that. And that was great because for the very first time, you're not alone with, I mean, back then it wasn't even a laptop, it was pen and paper. You're not alone with your thoughts and your stories. You can actually share them with people, and you can listen to their work as well. So that's a massive experience. And you actually get feedback. And then you start to realize it's more than a hobby. And it's more than just you. So from joining just a writers group, I then joined the Writers Union, and I participated in all their meetings. I went to their AGM and any events, and I ended up first being treasurer, then secretary, and now currently I'm chairman. So it's just to become actively involved in these things. As a result of the Irish Writers Union, I was invited to become on the board of directors of the Irish Copyright Licensing Association, and then also the Irish Writers Centre in Dublin. And again, it's just about being active in the writing community, because it's a very lonely business. So to actually meet other writers and just participate in various events and groups, it's just very inspiring. And I don't know that it helps to get your work out there, but certainly you realize how difficult it is for everybody, including the famous names and the top professionals. And
Correct.
you realize it's not just you.
Yes.
But I think to be published, it's quite sad, but it's one of those catch-22s that publishers need a known name. So for me, the big break came from the fact that I was, because I worked in the horse racing industry, and I started writing articles, and the more magazines that I wrote for in the racing industry, I won awards for my work. And as soon as I applied to a publisher and said that I was an award-winning journalist, that's when the same book that had been rejected 20 years ago was accepted. And I think it's because they know that they have a name that they can market, and that's quite important.
Exactly. Right. Now, speaking about that, speaking about trying to promote our work through our career. I mean, probably through the job that we do, right? I think it reminds me of another author who also did kind of the same thing. Like, I remember him sharing that whenever he goes for conferences out there, so what he does is to also talk about his writing journey, and also to share a little bit about his book. And that's where he started to get some audience, and also probably some fans, like, wanted to read his book. And and they started to subscribe to his newsletters and keep in touch with them. So I think it's about the balance of how you carry all your the hats, like, different hats that you wear, how you carry all your personality or different sides of yourself everywhere you go, without without bugging people, like, to, hey, read my book. Instead of saying that, I think you authentically promote your work by saying what you do, and and then let just people decide if they want to read your book or not, right? So you reminded me about that fact, right? So now coming to finding a publisher or coming to get the books published, right? So could you actually tell us if you chose to self-publish, or if it was a traditionally, I mean, your first book, was it traditionally published, and what are the pros and cons, and how do you feel in terms of marketing your books? How is it going so far for you?
Well, the marketing is the big aspect. So the very first book I wrote, as I say, was Chantilly Dawns, which Maverick House took up a few years ago. But after that, I had an interest in Roman history. So I wrote a book about the Roman Emperor Nero, which was set in first century Rome. Now, I went down the same path of sending it to all the publishers that dealt with that genre. The feedback was very good. And I was told that, the story was good, the characterization was good, the writing was good, but it's a very niche market and it didn't fit their shelves at that moment. So basically we sat back, my husband and myself, and we said, well, there's nothing wrong with the book. It's just the marketplace that's wrong. And if somebody can publish a book, surely we can. So we looked into it. We got quotes from a printer, and we literally did it ourselves. So I sent my Word document to a printer, laid out exactly as I wanted it. My husband did the cover for me. And we bought, at that time, it wasn't print on demand. So we bought a set number of copies that were delivered, and away we went in the back of the car, driving around all the bookshops, museums, galleries, anything with a Roman connection, asking if we could leave in 10 copies at a time on sale or return. The marketing is difficult because you basically you use your local paper, and it's amazing how local you can suddenly become to where you were born, where you went to school, where you work, where relations live. You kind of be very creative in that department and try to get the word out there. But basically, it was just footwork, driving around with books to the various shops and outlets. And then, of course, it went up on Amazon, and Amazon, you just sit back and hope, word of mouth, that it becomes popular, which it did. But then with the first book, Chantilly Dawns, that was accepted by a mainstream publisher, that was a different experience to begin with, because you go into the office, you sign a contract, and the publisher does everything. You hand him your Word document and you just sit back. But the reality these days is that publishers don't have a big budget for marketing, so they expect you to do a lot. So you're still contacting your papers, you're still out there trying to plug the book, and you've no control whatsoever. So with Nero, I could physically go around and see sales. With my publisher, every year I just wait for a statement to come. It tells me the sales and, happy days, but you're in the dark. So yes, it's really easy. You just sit back and wait for a royalty check and let the publisher do the work. But that, being in the dark and not knowing, when you have self-published, you realize there's not a lot of difference between the two, but you don't have that control. But the returns from the publisher are obviously much better because they can market and reach such a broader audience.
Correct. Yeah. So throughout, these years, right? Being an author, being a published author, and also being a member of various writing associations. So how do you see newcomers? New writers, debut authors. What is their main struggle, and what do you think that they should do differently? Because I think not everyone can become the director of the Writers Association like you, right? So, or probably to rise up to a level where people can actually see them, right? So, how else or how differently can they start marketing themselves? And probably can you like share your experience uh, about that, like your opinion about that?
Well, these days with social media, join different groups. So
Mm-hmm.
they can join writers groups, they can join readers groups and book clubs, and
Mm-hmm.
participate, be active. Don't plug your work, read other people's work, comment on other people's work. And if they're interested, they can look you up and find your work.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's quite important to make friends with writers. And if there's a book launch, go to the book launch, turn up on the night, mix with everybody. You may be introduced to their publisher, you don't know. And there could be other publishers there who take an interest in your work. You have to remember it's not about you, it's about somebody else. But just
Mm-hmm.
being there,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know what interest you'll attract. But,
Mm-hmm.
really, it just boils down to sitting at home, writing your book. And you write the book you want to read. You've got to enjoy it. You don't sit back and say, what's fashionable at the moment? What shall I write about? You think, what would I really love to read? And that's what I'm going to write. And you write that book and it stands alone. You send it to publishers. You perhaps publish it yourself, but it's the book that counts. You can do anything that you like and be at every party and be on every group, but it's no good unless you have the book to back it up. And you've got to write the best book you possibly can, and don't expect that because it's your first book it will be forgiven for mistakes or errors and that you'll get better, because you won't. You either write or you don't, and your first book is always going to be just as good as your 10th book or your 20th book. That's the standard readers expect. And that's the important thing is to concentrate actually on your writing and the work you're producing.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, speaking about awards, right? You have actually entered a lot of contests, and also you have been shortlisted for many awards, and you've won some of the awards. And could you actually tell us about the different awards that you've won, or the ones that you've been nominated for? Tell us about how did all that happen, and how actually artists should be looking out for more awards like this, or any sort of recognitions that can boost their author profiles even better. So tell us about that.
Well, with my day job is horse racing journalist,
Mhm.
and that's peer nominated basically. So there's one main award each year, the Derby Awards. If you have enough body of work throughout that year, 3 good pieces are chosen to go forward, and all of the members of the Horse Race Writers Association get to vote and choose which pieces they would like to see be finalists.
Mhm.
So that's completely out of your hands, really. But it's wonderful that I've been there for 12 years now in succession. I've won 3 awards from the Derby Awards. And every year I'm just consider myself incredibly lucky just to have been nominated. So, but with the fiction and books, when Nero was self-published, there was really no such thing as self-publishing, and it kind of it wasn't seen as indie publishing. It was almost like vanity publishing. You know, you're having to publish it because no publisher will. And so I was quite limited with the number of awards that I could nominate it for. So I sent it in for all the major awards that it qualified for, but there were quite a few that it wouldn't qualify for as a self-published book. Whereas these days, there are actually awards for self-published books and for independent books and indie authors. So you've just really got to do the research, perhaps Google, I don't know how you would do it, just discover which awards are out there and just invest the time and the money to send your book to every one that you possibly can in the hope of being shortlisted. With the other novels that were published by Maverick House, Maverick House put them forward for awards. And two of the thrillers were shortlisted for the Silver Dagger Crime Awards. I didn't win, but it's lovely to know that, you know, that you can actually say that. And, you know, for all the years of writing, it's just enough for me to have written a book, never mind to be nominated for anything. So, but to other writers, yeah, you've just got to do your homework and push your book forward everywhere that you can and you see an opportunity for it.
I think talking about that now, you also remind me about the importance of branding yourself as an author. Like, you have to put in the work. We writers, we are always known as you know, someone who prefers to be in the backstage. Like, you know, we are not really very comfortable talking about our own book or probably talking about our own work to people out there. So this is what we when I personally went for my own book launch a few months ago, what happened was I can sort of sense that authors in general, we feel so reluctant to speak about our work or what we've written, because we are so comfortable about writing, you know, and we don't really think about how to market ourselves. But thinking or probably considering the scenario of the publishing industry, whether it's the indie publishing or the traditional publishing arena, it is so important for authors to actually have a presence on social media. It is so important for authors to connect or engage with the correct group of readers out there, right? So, and also not forgetting the importance of engaging with potential literary agents out there. So, how have you actually approached any literary agents, or probably have they approached you? And how can actually authors build a connection with literary agents, like, you know, in the hope to get their books published or probably to be represented to publishers?
It's very difficult, actually. I don't know the circumstances elsewhere in the world. In Ireland and Britain are very closely linked. And we find that in the UK, publishers nowadays won't accept a book directly from the author. They only accept from an agent, because the agent is their kind of filtering process.
Yes.
Whereas in Ireland, that hasn't taken off yet. I think we've only 4 literary agents based in Ireland. And it's harder to get an agent than it is a publisher, because there are more publishers. So for us here, we're quite fortunate. We can go direct to a publisher. The Irish Writers Union offers a free contract service to members, which is a job that the agent would normally do for you. So we're kind of cutting out the agent and keeping that 10% for ourselves, which is quite valuable. The only contact I had with an agent was basically it was a seminar, and there was an agent giving a talk as to what they would like from an author. And they were describing my first book, actually, Chantilly Dawns, which was they wanted something that was by an Irish author, had Irish connections, but was set beyond Ireland, that was international appeal. So afterwards, I went up and introduced myself. It was a lady agent. And I said I had a book. It was set in France and the UK. The hero was French. And she said, "Oh, this sounds marvelous. Tell me more about the hero." And I said, "Well, his name is Marcel Descent, and he's a jockey." And she said, "Okay, I'm going to stop you there." She said, "You're a woman and your book is set in a sports world and your hero is a man." She said, "Won't work. I'm not interested." We always think about sexism. We don't expect it to be coming from another woman, whereas my publisher, thankfully, is a man, and he didn't care who wrote the book and he didn't care who the hero was. So
that was very, very ironic.
My experience of agents isn't great, but
right. Yeah, I think that's very ironic for a woman to say that. But again, I think it also tells us about, or probably it actually reflects about how perceptions can actually differ from one person to another person, vastly, right? So coming to your book and also your profession as a horse riding journalist, right, and in the industry, and also your books also have some of the elements of horse riding industry in the horse riding industry. So how do you connect the stories? Like, how do you get the inspiration? How do you write? Or probably coming to the theme of today's talk is actually to weave a story that is realistic and also relatable. So tell us about interesting characters that you have in your book.
Well, I think coming back to the theme of the show, to have a piece of fiction that's realistic and relatable, it comes down to the character. So you're always asking for the plot, you're always asking what if. So you look around the world that you know and you're familiar with, and you say, but what if this happened? Or what if a person was in this situation? And then with the characters, you have to ask why. So it's not enough that they're a bad person. It's not enough that they have this ambition. You have to ask why. What's their real driving force? What's the motivation? And because I'm so familiar with the horse racing world, and it's quite a closed bubble. It's quite a small world. And in Ireland, we would know people in France and Germany and America. It's a very tiny community and everybody's very close. And the first thing with drama is to have that bubble, that somebody's shut into this enclosed little world, is marvelous as a writer, because immediately you've got so many constraints. And if, I look around me and I think, what if that person was to, they're on a pinnacle now. If you think of somebody famous like Frankie Dettori, and what would happen if he was disgraced? And it's not just a matter of people turning their backs, but if you're warned off for anything in the horse racing circle and you lose your license, you can also lose your license for associating with a person who has lost their license. So it suddenly becomes, not only is Frankie Dettori disgraced, but all the people he worked with and was friends with and knew him have that risk of also being disgraced just by mixing with him. So you think, wow, this is a tremendous thing. So, and I don't agree with it. It's the policing element is far too strict and far too extreme. But from a writer's point of view, it's wonderful, because I don't think we play God, we play devil, because it's much more fun once we get our talents into a character. And I think with creating a character as well, they pop up in my head and I have to live with them for a long length of time. I don't know how long they're there with me. And I know everything about them. I know their childhood, their school days, their parents, their grandparents. And then they start to slip up and reveal to me a weakness or a flaw or a fear. And that's when I pounce. And that's when I realize that there's a plot and what I can do with them. So for the horse racing, I have a trilogy, 3 horse racing thrillers. And they're not really connected, but because of the world that they're in, the main character of one book might be a small character of another book, and there's a continuation of characters and plot and place, sense of place. But the main thing is that I took that idea of somebody in that small environment and almost a small town environment, and what happens when things go wrong, things that they take for granted go wrong, and then how that affects things from their background. You know, their whole world is turned upside down. So in the first book, Chantilly Dawns, I had a champion French jockey who was wrongly accused of fixing races, and you know, everybody turned against him because they felt that they'd been robbed, and he just completely lost his confidence. So he wasn't able to go out and try and fight for his innocence. So it was, how do the people around him help him? How does he come to terms with that? And how does he rebuild his life until he has the confidence to go out there and say, look, I've been made a scapegoat. I'm not guilty. I'm prepared to fight for it. But before he's prepared to fight, you know, he is prepared to die almost. You know, he sinks to rock bottom. And in the next book, Gala Day, which is probably, I wrote them in a different order, so I would prefer that to be the third book, even though I wrote it as the second. Again, we have a jockey who's really successful in his youth. It went to his head, you know, he blew it. He lived the high life, and he's suddenly got to rebuild his life again. You know, he's got used to living the high life, and as his career has gradually gone downhill slightly, he's never really kept up with that. So he's a big bit of a playboy, and there's a reputation surrounding him. You know, how does he maintain that lifestyle? Is he a bit crooked? And although he isn't, he loves the idea that he's got a reputation and it suits his lifestyle. And suddenly when it comes to the point, hey, I've got to get serious, I've really got to get my career back on track, he realizes that the reputation he's created for himself is now a millstone, and it's dragging him down. And that's much more of a standard thriller, and you know, more of an adventurous book. And then finally, St. Bastian is probably a very dark psychological drama, and that's less about the horse racing, more about relationships.
Correct.
And the fact that one of the characters is a jockey is just useful because he's fighting a ticking bomb, in that he's 17 years old, so he's not fully grown yet. He's too heavy to be a jockey, so he's got weight issues and eating disorders to keep his weight in order. And his father sees him as amoral. They don't get on at all. And his father now feels that he's a threat, and that the could be coincidence, could be accidents, but there have been too many things going wrong in his stable to be put down to coincidence or accidents. And he thinks his son is involved. And, you know, that's a tricky thing, because if your children go off the rails, people automatically point a finger and say the parents are to blame. You know, they were brought up badly, they were wrongly raised, bad,
Yes.
you know, and he knows he's done nothing wrong. The poor father has done his best for the son. So he doesn't want people to know that his son's going off the rails. So does he try and cover up and protect the family name? But he's risking his staff, you know, the people around him. He's putting them at risk by covering up for the son. So he's in this terrible dilemma. What does he do? And that's really what I was looking at then. And once you get into the psychological thing, why does the father not get on with the son, and what are the reasons behind it? And you start to just dig and dig and dig. And I think that digging and that asking why and questioning why people behave in a particular way is what builds a solid character and something that the reader can engage with and identify with, which is really important. You know, we may not have been in that experience ourselves, but we can empathize and we can identify with it. And I think that's hopefully what makes it, well, I know it's what makes a good character in other books. Hopefully it's what makes my characters good.
Yeah. So speaking about writing these books, and you know, with all these interesting characters, and then publishing it, and considering the fact that, you know, probably the ones your friends, your colleagues in the horse riding industry would have read your book, right? So what is their feedback like, you know, after reading your books? And like, do they feel excited about reading something that's very relatable to their very own industry? Or what do they actually think about your book?
Well, thankfully the feedback has been excellent, better than I could have hoped for. I knew it was right. I mean, I'd worked from the bottom up. So I'd worked in stables, I'd worked behind the scenes, I've worked in front of the camera, if you like. So I knew that I had the technical details. I knew that everything was right about it. But because it's a book and because it's drama, you have to exaggerate things. So you have to put, you know, the horse racing world is very well policed for a start. So to write a thriller where there are baddies is quite, you're suspending a bit of belief because it's really not quite possible to happen. And the first thing that I wasn't expecting was that people kept saying, is this about so-and-so? Oh, is this so-and-so in the book? And none of it was based on real people. So it was nice that they kind of felt that this could be a real person, or this was a real incident that happened. And it's also good that they're comparing it to real things, because it showed that it was very believable and that they are relating to it, which is what we all aim for as a writer. But the feedback has been good. Jockeys and trainers have read all three books and enjoyed them. They're not people I necessarily know, but if I happen to meet them, they'll remark upon it. And to such an extent that I was invited by a trainer in Newmarket in the UK to hold my most recent book launch in her stables, which was just lovely because the book was set in a racing stables. There we were having what we called a living launch at the Newmarket stables of Ilka Gansera-Levesque. And, you know, whenever, like Facebook has memories, and every year you get the pictures pop up, and you know, she always comments on what a lovely day it was. And her owners all came out to visit their horses and to see the launch, and various racing press. And I think it's important, if you're basing a series of books within a particular industry, that the people within that industry recognize that the story is correct and it is very real. So, you know, that goes for any writer, even fantasy and sci-fi. You know, there's there's an element of people who are so into that genre, and they would pick up any little thing that was any error, anything that wasn't credible. So it's not just down to our imaginations as writers. The reader has a very sharp imagination, and they'll soon spot if something's wrong. So.
Right, exactly. So tell us about your upcoming books. Are you writing any books at this point of time? Maybe your NaNoWriMo participants, like your participation in the past, have you written any books recently? And are you planning to publish any one of them in 2020?
Hopefully, I don't know at this point, because I am writing a book. It's another horse racing thriller. It isn't a dark psychological one. It's much lighter, and it's less behind the scenes of racing and more general, outside in the real world almost. And it's about three people with their own sets of problems that merge and become intertwined. There's some money stolen from a betting office, and the lady that works in the betting office is one of the main suspects. Her son is at school, and he's just started a work placement in a racing stable, and the racing stable in which he works have just acquired the best horse that they could ever imagine owning, but can't really afford to have a horse of this quality. So they're in a dilemma. What do? They don't want to sell it, but suddenly they could do with the amount of money that was stolen from the betting office, and we're beginning to see some connections. I'm actually probably only about 30,000 words through it at the moment, and because of my other work and my other commitments, I'm finding it really difficult just to sit down and give it the time. And it's really easy to let things slip and to say, there's plenty of time. I can do this. And now I'm beginning to see, as writers, we all have that ticking clock for our characters. And I now have my own ticking clock. So, yes, I would love to see it published in 2020. And the first thing I've got to do is finish it. So
yes, I'm sure you can do it. If you are 30,000 words into the books, I'm sure that you will be able to publish it in 2020. So I believe that your colleagues and also your family will be anticipating your new book. And before we end our show today, I would probably like you to tell what message do you have for your very own audience, for your fans, and also for upcoming writers, because hopefully the ones who will be watching this later on, the ones who are watching this right now, hopefully they will be able to get some useful tips from you or from this show and try to implement it in their own writing journey to be able to sell their work better, or probably to even sell themselves better as an author.
Well, Jasvina, I think you've really provided the best tips for the writers out there in promoting their work. Social media, actively engaging with all the groups on social media, with readers. Go to your library even and ask if you can do a reading from your book. That people would enjoy that. And perhaps your local bookstore. There's so many ways out there that you can go and promote your book. But the most important thing is to not promote your book and your work, but to engage with other writers and readers and just make your name known. And for readers, I think the important message is don't be shy and don't be embarrassed in providing feedback. As writers, we never meet the people who read our books. Very, very rarely do we bump into people who comment on the book.
Correct.
And if it's family and friends, they sometimes don't like to comment because they're afraid you're going to ask them a question.
Yes.
And like everybody, you know, you read a book one week and you've kind of forgotten half of it the following week.
Yes.
And the last thing you want is for an author to say, oh, what did you think of so-and-so? And what did you think happened? You know, and they can't remember and they're too embarrassed. So feedback from readers is wonderful, and please go on to Amazon and Goodreads or anywhere that you've purchased your book and leave a review, and never be afraid to leave a bad review, because even bad reviews are helpful. You know, if I'm buying a book and I look at a review and it says, oh, I hated it, you know, there was too much violence, and I, you know, and I'm thinking, I quite like that. That would appeal to me, you know, not enough love story. And I'm thinking, oh, thank God, you know, at last. So, but be critical in a constructive way. You know, it's not enough just that you didn't like it or it wasn't to your taste. You know, say why. But I think readers are often a bit too shy to provide feedback. So that was the thing I would encourage them to do. And for writers, you know, yes, marketing your work is important, but writing the work is important. Just write. Just go out and write what you want to write. That's what the advice.
And also, I think being consistent in promoting your work, like, you know, if you're on social media, I think the consistency in promoting our work is very crucial, because you would want to be known as a writer. Like, you would want to remind your audience that constantly remind your audience that, hey, something is just going on about me and my writing world that I would want you to see, or I would want you to give a try. And I think consistency is what we all struggle with, like, you know, in terms of promoting our work in a consistent way. So I think with just about anything that we do, like, you know, even if you enroll yourself in an exercise program, or in an educational program, that I think you have to put in your 100%, and in order to see the result. So I think this also applies to our writing journey as an author, where we have to, like, consistently brand ourselves as an author. We have to consistently put ourselves out there and say, proudly say what we have done, and ask people for their feedback without hesitation. So I think this is one of the biggest challenge, definitely one of the biggest challenges that we authors have faced. Even I, as an author, I face that, and even my other friends where I live in right now, we all face the same kind of issues, right? Because you feel so reluctant to share your work, and when we see some other person, some other author who is consistently sharing his work out there. There's this particular author who's consistently sharing his work out there, and, you know, it's just so amazing that we can see the feedback from his fans, or the level of engagement from his fans on his Instagram page, or maybe even on Facebook. So that really shows that, you know, you are committed to market your work out there, and also to engage with your potential audience. So I think it is wonderful to have you on my show today, Lisa, and also to have you share your experience in the writing industry. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us, and also briefly explaining about your characters, the interesting characters that you have in your book. And hopefully the audience will be able to take the key takeaway messages that we have from today's show. Thank you so much for joining, Lisa. And I know it's about 3 o'clock in the morning where you're right now. It's ridiculous to have you stay up for this show, but thank you so much nevertheless for joining the show. And hoping to connect with you in next interviews that we may have in 2020, and also wishing you all the best for your next book. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us, and also Merry Christmas and season's greetings.
Thank you, Josephina. Season's greetings to you, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, even at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.